Good Friday, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for June what is today? The 8th, the 9th. Today is June the 9th. We are reading together in Joshua chapter 3 and Joshua chapter 4. Thanks so much for taking some time to read along with me today on this Friday. Hope that your Friday is going well so far, and hope we can add a little bit of goodness to this Friday with a little bit of Bible reading today. Let me get the text up on the screen for us, and we'll read along together here in Joshua chapter 3 and Joshua chapter 4. It'd be better if I got to Joshua chapter 3, wouldn't it? So let me see here. Let me scroll on up real fast. Joshua chapter 3. Remember, so far in our read through Joshua, we have read the mantra of this conquest is going to be strong and courageous. And be strong and courageous because God is with you, and he will bless you. He will go before you and strengthen you to do everything that he is leading you to do. The first obstacle along the way is going to be Jericho, and they have gone and spied out Jericho, and we've seen not exactly a Hebrew who has shown great courage and strength, but in fact a pagan, Rahab, has shown strength and courage in trusting in God because of everything she's heard that he has done, to the extent that she is willing to save and to hide and to protect the spies that have gone into Jericho, so that whenever they come back through and conquer the city, that her and her family will be spared. So we've seen strength, we've seen courage from many different places up to this point, and we're going to see that continuing here as we go throughout this text of Joshua 3 and Joshua 4. Maybe my light here will decide to stay on for me. Maybe not. And if not, that's okay. I think we got enough light here to make this work. All right, Joshua chapter 3 and Joshua chapter 4. Joshua 3, verse number 1. Joshua 3, verse number 1, Joshua started early the next morning and left the Acacia Grove with all the Israelites. They went as far as the Jordan and stayed there before crossing. After 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, when you see the Ark of the Covenant, whenever you see the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh your God, carried by the Levitical priest, you are to break camp and follow it. But keep a distance of about 1,000 yards between yourselves and the ark. Don't go near it, so that you can see the way to go, for you haven't traveled this way before. Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, because Yahweh will do wonders among you tomorrow. Then he said to the priest, carry the Ark of the Covenant and go ahead of the people. So they carried the Ark of the Covenant and went ahead of them. Yahweh spoke to Joshua today. I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so they will know that I will be with you, just as I was with Moses. Command the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, when you reach the edge of the water, stand in the Jordan. Then Joshua told the Israelites, come closer and listen to the words of Yahweh your God. He said, you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly dispossess before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites, when the Ark of the Covenant of when the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of the whole earth goes ahead of you into the Jordan. Now choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one man for each tribe. When the feet of the priests who carry the Ark of Yahweh, the Lord of the whole earth, come to rest in the Jordan's waters, its water will be cut off. The water flowing downstream will stand up in mass. When the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, carried the Ark of the Covenant ahead of the people. Now the Jordan overflows its banks throughout the harvest season. But as soon as the priests carrying the ark reached the Jordan, their feet touched the water at its edge, and the water flowing downstream stood still, rising up in a mass that extended as far as Adam, a city next to Zarethan. The water flowing downstream into the Sea of the Arabah, the Dead Sea, was completely cut off, and the people crossed opposite Jericho. The priests carrying the Ark of Yahweh's covenant stood firm on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground until the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan. After the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan, Yahweh spoke to Joshua, choose 12 men from the people, one man for each tribe, and command them, take 12 stones from the place in the middle of the Jordan where the priests are standing, carry them with you, and set them down at the place where you spend the night. So Joshua summoned the 12 men who he had selected from the Israelites, one man for each tribe, and said to them, "Go to the ark of Yahweh your God in the middle of the Jordan. Each of you lift a stone onto his shoulder, one for each of the Israelite tribes, so that this will be a sign among you in the future when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean to you?' You should tell them, 'The water of the Jordan was cut off in front of the ark of Yahweh's covenant. When it crossed the Jordan, the Jordan's water was cut off. Therefore, these stones will always be a memorial for the Israelites.'" When the Israelites did just as Joshua had commanded them, the 12 men took stones from the middle of the Jordan, one for each of the Israelite tribes, just as Yahweh had told Joshua. They carried them to the camp and set them down there. Joshua also set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan, where the priest who carried the ark of where the priest who carried the ark of the covenant were standing. The stones are still there today. The priests carrying the ark continued standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything was completed that Yahweh had commanded Joshua to tell the people. In keeping with all that Moses had commanded Joshua, the people hurried across, and after everyone had finished crossing, the priest with the ark of Yahweh crossed in the sight of the people. The Reubenites, Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh went in battle formation in front of the Israelites, and Moses had instructed them, about 40,000 equipped for war, crossed to the plains of Jericho in Yahweh's presence. On that day, Yahweh exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they revered him throughout his life as they had revered Moses. Yahweh told Joshua, "Command the priest to carry the ark of the testimony to come up from the Jordan." So Joshua commanded the priest, "Come up from the Jordan." And when the priest carrying the ark of Yahweh's covenant came up from the middle of the Jordan, and their feet stepped on the dry ground, the water of the Jordan resumed its course, flowing over all the banks as before. The people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month and camped at Gilgal on the eastern limits of Jericho. Then Joshua set up in Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken from the Jordan, and he said to the Israelites, "In the future, when your children ask their fathers, 'What is the meaning of these stones?' you should tell your children, 'Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For Yahweh your God dried up the water of the Jordan before you until you had crossed over, just as Yahweh your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed over. This is so that all the peoples of the earth may know that Yahweh's hand is strong, and so that you may know to always fear Yahweh your God." And that is Joshua chapter 3 and Joshua chapter 4. All right, thinking about these two texts here together, two main thoughts really stand out from these texts. Number one, there's a test of faith that is going on, and then there's also ironically, a reminder for the need to remember. A test of faith and a need to remember. And also what we see here in a major theme within these texts, and I think it becomes pretty apparent, especially as we've been doing what we've been doing, reading through the text and in its entirety and noting everything that's come up to this point, we hopefully recognizing that there's a lot of Passover echoes that are taking place here within this text, not just Passover echoes, but also Exodus echoes that are being found here. So we start off where they are leaving. They leave the Acacia Grove with all the Israelites. Joshua is in front, and he tells that the ark is to go ahead of all the people. And the people, as they are led by the ark, which is the representation of their covenant with Yahweh, which in a sense is representing Yahweh himself, they are to follow it. They are not to be the ones that are directing themselves on this journey, but they are to allow God to direct them on this journey, because it's said at the end of verse number 4, you don't know this way. You've never gone this way before, so I'm going to lead you. But also recognize that they were told they needed to stay 1,000 yards back from the ark, that they needed to respect the ark as sacred space. So they're almost a half mile, it seems, back behind the ark. Again, allowing God to lead, but also recognizing his holiness and the sacred space that was the Ark of the Covenant. They are told that they need to be consecrated because, again, Yahweh's presence is going to be among them in the mighty deeds that he is doing, and the fact they are going to be passing by the Ark of the Covenant. And then we also see that Yahweh tells Joshua that I'm going to exalt you as I exalted Moses before you. Basically say, I'm going to show everybody that you are now in Moses's place. You are now carrying the mantle of Moses as the leader of this people. You are the new leader, and you will be the one leading them along the way, just as Moses had done previously. You're going to know that, or the people are going to know that as I work through you, that they're going to recognize me as, again, being God, being the Almighty God who will hand over and dispossess the land from all the people that are mentioned in verse number 11. Again, the Canaanites, Hethites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. So be ready for that. Be ready for this. We're going to see in chapter 4 that they're going to go over in battle formation, because this is a conquest. This is holy war that is about to take place. Now, what stands between them and the land, of course, is the Jordan River. And the Jordan River, we might, I don't know what our thinking of what the Jordan River might be. We might think, oh, well, it's, no major river like we have today. Even just thinking about the Tennessee River, the river that we cross over whenever you go from Loudon going towards Lenoir City on Highway 11. That's a pretty substantial river. I think, if I remember right, in portions of the river where the creek channel especially is, it's like 30 feet deep. So it's a very substantial body of water. It is not just a creek or anything like that you can cross over knee deep. And that's the same way for the Jordan. Although in the Jordan, at some places, it'd be about 2 foot deep. It would go up to 12 foot deep at places. And that's just normal. That would be the normal depth of the river. So even in the 12-foot portions, that would certainly be uncrossable. But the ante is raised here in the fact that Yahweh has chosen the time for them to cross the Jordan during its high season. Specifically, in verse number 15, we read that the Jordan overflows its banks throughout the harvest season. What do we mean by overflow? Well, by overflow, we mean that the Jordan in some places gets to be around a mile wide, and is also, the current of the river is torrential. It's a very strong current, because we have to think we're in a land where there's a lot of elevation change. So the gravity is naturally drawing all of this extra water downstream faster toward the Dead Sea. And it is a very strong current. There is no way they could have crossed over this river on their own. It would have been impossible. They would have died. No one would have survived. But that's where Yahweh comes in, because Yahweh is testing them to see whether or not they trust him, and whether or not they're going to allow him to do his mighty works among them. So as soon as the priests enter the river, the text tells us that the water flowing downstream stood still, rising up in a mass that extended as far as Adam, the city next to Zarethan. And this language of rising up in a mass, the same type of language that was used in the Song of Moses. And that was back in Exodus chapter 15, where it talked about how God had blessed them by giving them safe passage through the Red Sea. The exact same thing that happened in the Red Sea, where God controlled the water, we see happening here in the Jordan, where he stopped the water. If they're marching, they would have been marching from east to west, and the water would be flowing from north to south. So as they're going to cross, all the water on their right hand side would have walled up in a mass, and the water that would have been on the left would have continued to go downstream, and everything else would have just been dry. There would have been this dry space for them to walk through. And how incredible that must have been for them to be able to see this, to see that once again Yahweh was allowing them to pass through. Now, they might see the water stop, but they still have to trust that Yahweh is going to continue to hold the water up. Because what happens if they start crossing halfway and they get, Egyptian armied? Meaning that as they're going, as they're in the process of crossing, the water comes back through. They have to trust that God is going to keep that water exactly where it is, and that he's not going to release it, and that he is going to allow them to cross on the other side. So at the end of chapter 3 in verse 17, we see that the priest carrying the Ark of the Covenant stood firmly on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground until the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan. So we pause there. We pause that scene there, and we enter into chapter 4 and verses 1 through 9, emphasize the need to remember, where it talks about after the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan. This is telling them the things that are going to take place after the fact, as we're going to see here in a minute once we get to chapter 10. or once we get to verse number 10, that it really does pick up. The scene stays there. So in a sense, what we see in verses 1-9 is that he's looking forward to the next scene that's going to take place. So when they have finished crossing the Jordan, when the people have finished crossing, Yahweh spoke to Moses and said, hey, go get 12 men and tell them to go get 12 stones from near the Ark of the Covenant. So we're thinking, put them on your shoulder. So these had to be some sort of substantial stones, and you're going to bring them back to the camp, and you're going to set them up, and they're going to be a memorial. They're going to be a memorial so that later on in the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean, you have the opportunity to tell them, well, these stones mean that Yahweh saves. These stones mean that Yahweh provides, that Yahweh delivers, that Yahweh keeps his promises. The water of the Jordan was cut off in front of the Ark of Yahweh's covenant when it crossed the Jordan, and the Jordan's waters were cut off. Therefore, the stones will always be a memorial for the Israelites. They don't need to forget. And this is something that we've seen a number of times. In fact, throughout the Exodus story are these various memorials that have been set up. One of those being the Passover, which we're going to see the connection to the Passover here in just a few moments. But also with the song that we see in Exodus 15 was to help them to remember what God had done as they crossed over the Red Sea. So the Israelites did just as Joshua had said. They took the 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, set them up at the camp. And then we see that Joshua also set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan where the priests who are carrying the Ark of the Covenant were standing. And the stones are still there today. So as they're reading this, as this text is being authored, the author recognizes that these stones that have been set up, they are still there today. You can go see them. You can be reminded of God's provision. So that we pick up then from chapter 3, verse 17 again, where the priests carrying the ark continued standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything was completed that Yahweh had commanded Joshua to tell the people, in keeping with all that Moses had commanded Joshua. The people hurried across, and after everyone had finished crossing, then we see the military language that the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh, they go ahead of Israel, because remember that was a big kerfluffle that took place whenever they ask if they can have the land east of the Jordan, that Moses freaks out and says, you're abandoning the Lord. And they said, no, we're going to show you that we're so faithful to Yahweh by going and not just helping you in battle, but leading the battle. Remember, there was the language in that text. They wanted to lead. They wanted to be in the front. They're going to show their fidelity with the people by being the first ones to go ahead in battle formation. So on that day then, that is referencing back in chapter 3 and verse number 7. Let's remember there, Yahweh said, today I'm going to exalt you. So now we see on that day, Yahweh did exalt Moses in the sight of all Israel. And the text says they revered him throughout his life as they had revered Moses. And Moses told Joshua, command the priest to carry the ark, the testimony, to come up from the Jordan. So that he did that. And he told them, all right, time for you to come up from the Jordan. And as soon as their feet left the Jordan, the text says the water flowing, the water in the Jordan resumed its course, flowing all over the banks as before. I cannot imagine that scene. It'd be like this, being able to see a dam holding back just a ton of water and it being released, and just the flowing, the rushing that comes down all at once. That's what the people would have seen here in this moment. So verse 19 is very important through the end of the chapter, very important portion of this text. The people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month and camped at Gilgal on the eastern limits of Jericho. This would have been 40 years to the day that the Passover prep began. So we have, in a sense, the beginning of the Exodus taking place on that day, 40 years prior. And then we have 40 years later, the fulfillment of it, that this Exodus, this deliverance, this promise began to be initiated or began to be fulfilled. And now it has been fulfilled. They have crossed over into the promised land. On that day, 40 years ago, Yahweh said, we're starting on this journey to the promised land. 40 years later, he can say, we have completed this journey to the promised land. Now, obviously, there's still a lot of work to do. And in fact, the conquest has to take place, but they are now in the land. So they have these 12 stones again, and it is re-emphasized in the text. And they said to the Israelites, in the future, when your children ask their fathers, what is the meaning of these stones? You should tell your children that Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For notice this, notice where all the emphasis is put. Notice who receives the glory and the credit for this. For Yahweh your God, dried up the water of the Jordan until you crossed over. Just notice the connection here. He wants to make this connection. This is the second generation's Exodus events. They have the first generation exited Egypt into the wilderness, and now this generation is exiting the wilderness into the promised land. So they did this just as Yahweh your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed over. This is so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Yahweh's hand is mighty, and so that you may know to always fear Yahweh your God. So remember, that was also a point of the Exodus, that all the nations of the earth are going to hear what Yahweh had done in the Exodus, and that they would know that he is all powerful, that he is almighty, which that was evidence as being true with Rahab. But it's also done so that you, his people, may know of his strength, and that you may fear him, and that you might respect him, and that you might follow him wherever he leads you as you continue on in this conquest. So that's what we have here in Joshua chapters 3 and Joshua chapter 4. We have these texts that are a test of faith. Are they going to trust Yahweh to cross the river on dry ground? And are they also going to continue to remember that it is Yahweh who gave them the ability to do these things? That's what we see here within these texts. If you have any questions or comments about these texts, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. And of course, the lessons for us are to, again, when we come across our own test of faith, when there are decisions to be made within our own lives, are we going to trust God and cross that Jordan of a decision on dry ground? Or are we going to shrink away from confidence in Yahweh and not do as he commands? Are there things in our lives that we have set up to help remember what God has done for us? Certainly, he has given us the memorial that we partake in every first day of the week to do so. But I would encourage us also to do other things, to help remind us often of the good things that God has done for us in our lives. In doing so, we can often be reminded of the goodness of God, of his power, and of his strength. And in fact, that will help us to make better decisions when we come into those moments. I thank you so much for tuning into this reading on this Friday. Hope you have a great rest of your Friday. We'll be back at it again tomorrow, reading together. I believe we're just reading Joshua chapter 5. Let me double check that. I'll make sure I give out accurate information. Yep, tomorrow we'll be reading from Joshua chapter 5. Hope you can tune in then. Take care. God bless.